What really happened to the lost princes in the tower? Hey guys. Tonight we were dimming the lights and stepping quietly into a place that doesn't exist anymore. At least not the way it used to. Imagine London, late 15th century. The air smells like wet stone and wood smoke. Horses clatter over muddy streets. And somewhere beyond the city's chaos, the Tower of London stands. Heavy, quiet, pretending it's just another fortress. Except inside are two boys, royal, innocent, and vanishing into legend. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Get comfortable, maybe pull the blanket a little tighter. Because tonight's story isn't about ghosts or heroes. It's about family. A royal one, of course. Which means betrayal is basically baked into the DNA. Our main characters, Edward and Richard. Two brothers, the sons of King Edward IV and Queen Elizabeth Woodville. Edward the elder was about 12 when history decided to make him disappear. Richard the younger, around 9. Two kids who had the misfortune of being born into what we now politely call a dynastic nightmare. Their father, Edward IV, had been England's golden boy. Tall, handsome, victorious. The kind of man chroniclers couldn't stop drooling over. He'd beaten the Lancastrians in the Wars of the Roses, secured the throne, and, in a particularly scandalous move, married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner widow with children of her own, because nothing says romantic like setting off a decades-long political meltdown. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, he left behind a kingdom that was technically at peace, and a court full of people sharpening metaphorical knives. His eldest son, the little Prince Edward, was supposed to become King Edward V. Cute, right? A boy king. History loves those. Except in 15th century England, a child on the throne was basically an open invitation for ambitious uncles to start plotting. Enter Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the boy's uncle. You might know him by his later nickname, Richard III. You know, the one Shakespeare turned into a hunchbacked supervillain muttering about winter discontent and horse shortages. But before he became literary roadkill, Richard was a respected, loyal soldier. He'd fought bravely for his brother Edward IV, and people genuinely thought of him as honorable, which in the York family was saying something. When the king died, Richard was named Lord Protector, meaning he'd take care of things until the young Edward V came of age. It sounds noble. It wasn't. Let's float gently over the next few weeks, which historians usually describe using phrases like political tension and constitutional uncertainty. In other words, chaos. Elizabeth Woodville, the widowed queen, panicked. She tried to gather her family and supporters, probably planning to crown her son quickly and sideline her late husband's brothers. Richard, however, had other ideas and more soldiers. He intercepted the young prince on his way to London, escorted him to the tower for safety, because nothing says, "Trust me," like locking your nephew in a fortress famous for its torture chambers. But at the time, that wasn't as sinister as it sounds. The Tower of London wasn't just a prison, it was also a royal residence and the traditional place where kings waited before coronation. Still, people started whispering. The coronation was delayed, then cancelled, then quietly replaced with something else entirely. Richard himself being declared the rightful king. Convenient. He claimed that his late brother Edward IV had actually been secretly married to another woman before Elizabeth Woodville, making all of her children illegitimate. And therefore, young Edward V had no right to the throne. Of course he was, Richard said, merely acting in the name of justice. Because every medieval power grab came with a moral excuse attached. So now we have Richard III crowned king, and his two nephews, Edward and Little Richard, still in the tower. And here's where history goes fuzzy. Very fuzzy. Like, we have no reliable eyewitnesses, fuzzy. At first, the boys were seen playing in the tower gardens. Then they were seen less often. Then, not at all. And because this is medieval England, a place where gossip traveled faster than plague, rumors started spreading. People whispered that the boys had been murdered. Some said by guards, others by Richard himself. Some even pointed fingers at the Duke of Buckingham, one of Richard's closest allies. The truth? Well, that's the thing. Nobody knows. It's like the entire kingdom collectively blinked, and when they opened their eyes, the princes were just gone. No bodies, No confessions. No official record. Just absence. The kind that turns into legend over time. Let's pause and take a deep breath here. Because the disappearance of 2 children in royal custody isn't just a crime mystery. It's also a PR disaster. Richard III, the supposed protector, was now king. But the whispers never stopped. Every festival, every feast, every sermon seemed to hum with one unspoken question. What happened to the princes? Now, historians love evidence, but in this case, the evidence mostly comes in the form of 15th century gossip pamphlets and later Tudor propaganda. When Henry Tudor defeated Richard at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, ending Richard's reign and beginning the Tudor dynasty, the story practically wrote itself. Henry VII needed Richard to look like a monster, and what better way than to accuse him of murdering children? So the legend hardened. Richard the usurper, Richard the child killer, Richard the villain with the crooked back. Shakespeare would later take that smear campaign and turn it into pure gold. And let's be honest, no one remembers the Plantagenet family tree, but everyone remembers a horse, my kingdom for a horse. But let's drift back to the quieter question. If Richard didn't kill the princes, who did? There were theories, many, actually. Some claimed Henry VII himself had them killed after taking power, to remove any lingering Yorkist claimants. Others said the boys survived in secret, perhaps smuggled abroad or hidden by loyalists. At least one pretender, Perkin Warbeck, later popped up claiming to be the younger Prince Richard. Spoiler, he wasn't. What's fascinating, though, is how much this single event shaped the myth of English monarchy. It turned the Tower of London from a royal residence into a symbol of treachery. It turned a loyal uncle into a moral cautionary tale. And it gave future kings and playwrights an endless supply of guilt to dramatize. But let's not rush to conclusions. History rarely fits into neat moral boxes. Richard III might have been cruel, or he might have been a man cornered by politics and rumor, doing what he thought necessary to survive. And in a way, that's what makes this story so quietly haunting. 2 boys vanished, and England, for all its kings, chroniclers, and scholars, never really found them again. The disappearing princes and the blame game. So when we left off, Richard III had conveniently secured himself a crown, while his 2 nephews, Edward and Richard, were conveniently missing. Everyone in England could see the smoke, but no one dared to mention the fire. And if there's one thing the English nobility excelled at, it was pretending not to notice uncomfortable things, especially when those uncomfortable things involved royal blood and potential accusations of regicide. The court carried on, banquets were held, and Richard rode around the countryside being all kingly, inspecting towns, issuing pardons, and showing his best trust-me smile. The princes, meanwhile, were still technically safe in the tower. The problem was that no one saw them again, not even the servants, not even the guards who were supposed to be guarding them, which was, suspicious. But Richard never officially announced anything. No tragic illness, no accidental fall from the battlements. Nothing, just silence, the kind that made people start whispering in corners. Whispering in medieval England was dangerous, the kind that could turn into rebellion. Because if people believed the rightful heirs were dead, or worse, murdered, the legitimacy of Richard's rule evaporated faster than ale at a coronation feast. And that's exactly what started to happen. Let's float gently to autumn 1483. Barely months after Richard became king, a rebellion sparked, led by none other than the Duke of Buckingham. Remember him? Richard's close ally, the same one who helped him secure the throne? Yeah, him. Because why not double down on betrayal? Buckingham, it turned out, had regrets, or ambitions. Hard to tell with nobles. He joined forces with disaffected Yorkists and even some Lancastrians, former enemies, united under one banner. Get rid of Richard. And who did they want instead? Henry Tudor. Yes, that Henry. The awkward exile living in Brittany, clutching his thin claim to the throne like a lottery ticket that might someday cash in. He was a descendant of the Lancastrian line, distant but still technically royal. And since pretty much everyone in England was tired of Yorkist family drama, He suddenly looked like a decent option. But rebellion timing is everything, and Buckingham's uprising failed spectacularly. A rainstorm flooded the roads, supplies ran out, and the troops fell apart. Buckingham himself was captured and executed, which honestly is just another reminder that trying to out-scheme a man who keeps nephews in towers rarely ends well. Still, the whispers didn't stop. The prince's disappearance had already turned Richard's reign into a question mark. Pamphlets circulated claiming the boys were dead. One, in particular, came from a man named Dominic Mancini, an Italian cleric visiting England at the time. He wrote that the princes had been seen less and less behind the bars and windows, and that their guards had been dismissed. Mancini added with chilling understatement that they were never seen again. Now, Mancini didn't claim first-hand knowledge. It was hearsay. But his account became one of the earliest written sources suggesting the boys were killed while in Richard's custody. And once the rumor took hold, it never really let go. Let's float forward to 1485. The air smells of iron and wet grass. Richard III rides into battle at Bosworth Field, the final showdown between York and Lancaster. You already know how it ends. Richard, the supposed villain, cut down in the mud, his crown found under a bush. Henry Tudor wins, becomes Henry VII, and just like that, the narrative writes itself. The new king needed legitimacy, badly. He had to convince everyone that his reign was destiny, not opportunism. So what better way than to turn Richard into a monster and the missing princes into martyrs? And the Tudors were absolute professionals at rewriting history. Think of them as the original PR agency with better calligraphy. Chroniclers under Henry VII began to clarify what had happened in the Tower. The boys, they said, were smothered in their sleep, murdered quietly under Richard's orders. Some even named the assassins, Sir James Tyrrell and John Dighton, supposedly confessing years later under Henry VII's watch. Except, no written confession survives, no record of an execution, just a story that appeared right when the new king needed one. Convenient timing again. By the early 1500s, the idea that Richard murdered his nephews had become accepted truth. Not proven truth, just comfortable truth. The kind that makes moral sense, where villains act villainously and the rightful heirs die tragically to justify a new dynasty. And then came Shakespeare, because of course he did. In the late 16th century, good old Will picked up the Tudor-approved version of Richard III and dialed it up to 11. A hunchbacked schemer, a murderer of children, a snake with a crown. It made great theater and, unfortunately for Richard, permanent PR damage. No one leaves a Shakespeare play thinking, maybe he wasn't that bad. So by the time we hit the modern era, the princes in the Tower weren't historical figures anymore. They were symbols. Symbols of innocence crushed by ambition. Symbols of royal guilt buried beneath stone walls and polite silence. And yet, there are still puzzles, little fragments of doubt that make historians stare at dusty documents and go, wait a minute. For example, in 1674, nearly 2 centuries after the boys vanished, workmen at the Tower of London found a small box buried under a staircase. Inside were the bones of 2 children. The king at the time, Charles II, ordered them to be placed in Westminster Abbey in an urn labeled as the bones of the princes. Problem solved, right? Not really. No one examined the bones properly until 1933, and even then the methods were primitive. They found that the skeletons could belong to boys around the princes' ages, but they also could belong to anyone. London's history is basically a mass grave with architecture on top, so bones don't exactly come with name tags. Modern scientists have suggested re-examining them with DNA testing, but the monarchy has politely declined, which, to be fair, is very on-brand for the royal family, enthusiastic about tradition, allergic to clarity. And so we're left floating in historical limbo. The Tower stands. The urn rests in Westminster. Richard's bones, found in a parking lot in Leicester because history has a sense of humor, lie under a cathedral, and the 2 little princes remain somewhere between legend and unresolved case file. Their story is a mirror. Everyone sees in it what they want. To some, they're victims of tyranny. To others, pawns of propaganda. And to most of us, they're just another reminder that royal blood didn't guarantee safety. It only made your disappearance more interesting. The many theories, and the quiet truth beneath them. So we've got 2 missing boys, a conveniently crowned uncle, and 2 centuries worth of royal storytelling. It has one of those moments where history feels less like fact and more like a medieval true crime podcast that never got closure. Now, since the Tudors did such a fantastic job of turning Richard III into the medieval version of a movie villain, later historians have spent generations trying to decide if he actually did it, or if he was simply the fall guy in England's longest-running political cover-up. Let's float gently through some of the favorite theories, shall we? The good, the bad, and the mildly ridiculous. Theory 1. Richard III. Did it. This is the classic version. Simple, clean, and very convenient for everyone who came after. Richard had motive, means, and opportunity. He needed to secure his throne. He had access to the boys, and he had a couple of loyal men who would probably have done whatever unpleasant chore the king requested, no questions asked. Contemporary chroniclers, like Thomas More, writing decades later, described the murder in detail so vivid it almost felt like eyewitness reporting. More claimed that Sir James Tyrrell confessed to smothering the princes in their sleep with pillows, then burying them at the stair-foot, deep in the ground. A perfectly grim bedtime image. The problem? More wasn't alive when the event happened. He wrote his account during Henry VIII's reign, under the Tudors, and he worked in their court. Which means, yes, he was about as neutral as a royal press secretary. It's like writing a murder mystery where your boss is also the lead detective. So while his story gave later historians and playwrights a vivid script, it probably tells us more about Tudor propaganda than about Richard's conscience. Still, we can't fully exonerate Richard either. He benefited most from their disappearance, and his reign, short as it was defined by guilt he never publicly addressed. He never produced the boys alive to silence the rumors, which he could have done easily if they were safe. Instead, he acted as if the less said, the better. That's not a great look. Theory 2. Henry VII. Did it now? This theory has a sort of grim poetic irony to it. Henry Tudor, the conqueror who defeated Richard, might have cleaned up the last of the York family once he had power, just to make sure no one could challenge him. By 1485, the boys would have been in their mid-teens. If they were still alive somewhere, they'd be dangerous. All it would take was one ambitious nobleman to rally behind them, and England could plunge back into war. So, if Henry found them alive, it would have been politically safer to, not let them stay that way. It fits his reputation, too. Henry VII was cautious, secretive, and ruthlessly practical, less a king of romance and more a king of spreadsheets. The kind who thought loyalty was something you paid for, not inspired. If the princes died under his watch, he would have had every reason to bury the story deeper than the Tower's foundations and point the finger backward at Richard III, which, as luck would have it, is exactly what happened. Theory 3. The Duke of Buckingham did it. Ah, yes, the ever-popular scapegoat of convenience. Buckingham, who first helped Richard seize power and then tried to overthrow him, has been accused by some historians of acting on his own. Maybe he saw the boys as bargaining chips. Maybe he thought killing them would earn him Richard's trust. Or maybe he just wanted to tidy up a messy royal situation before launching his rebellion. The trouble is, Buckingham had neither the authority nor the direct access to the Tower once Richard was king. And even if he did it secretly, it's unlikely Richard wouldn't have found out. Let's just say that if Buckingham ordered anything that big, he wouldn't have had time to regret it. And history suggests Richard was very efficient at cleaning up problems. So while it makes for good gossip, the evidence for Buckingham as the killer is thin. More of a footnote in the soap opera than a leading role. Theory 4. The princes survived. This one's the historian's comfort fantasy. That somehow, miraculously, the boys escaped. Maybe smuggled out in disguise, maybe swapped with other children, maybe spirited away to Flanders or France, to grow up under assumed names. It's a nice thought. It would mean someone in that grim castle still had a conscience. But history isn't usually that generous. There were a few pretenders later, the most famous being Perkin Warbeck. who popped up in the 1490s claiming to be Richard, Duke of York. He managed to convince some pretty smart people, including European monarchs. He looked the part, spoke several languages, and carried himself like he'd been trained in royal courts. Henry VII, naturally, wasn't amused. Warbeck was captured, paraded, and eventually executed, but he maintained his story until the end. Was he the real prince? Almost certainly not. But the fact that people wanted to believe him tells you how deep the mystery still ran. And then there's the fifth theory, nobody knows, which honestly might be the closest to the truth. Because medieval England was a perfect storm of ambition, secrecy, and unreliable record-keeping. There's no solid proof of murder, no proven burial, no contemporary confession, just a disappearance that made political sense to several different people. And that's the hardest kind of mystery to solve. Over time, the story became less about the boys themselves and more about what they represented. They stopped being people and turned into symbols. Innocence betrayed by power, the moral cost of monarchy, the tragedy beneath the crown. And while historians have argued for centuries over who did what, most quietly agree on one thing. The princes were never meant to survive. Not because of some melodramatic plot twist, just because royal children were liabilities in a world where thrones were won by steel and rumor. They were ghosts long before they disappeared. Let's float briefly to modern times. In 2012, archaeologists famously uncovered Richard III's remains under a parking lot in Leicester. Spine curved, skull battered, and scientists grinning like they'd just met the final boss of British history. DNA proved the skeleton was really him, which is satisfying in a poetic sense. The villain finally found, the bones given dignity. But it didn't bring the princes any closer to being found. If anything, it reminded everyone just how thin the evidence still is. All we know for sure is this. Sometime in 1483, two royal boys entered the Tower of London. And from that point forward, every record, every eyewitness, every servant, every letter goes silent. No one ever saw them again. And 5 centuries later, we're still whispering their names in the dark. Bones, burials, and the strange case of the skeletons in the stairs. So, let us move forward a couple of centuries, because nothing says unsolved mystery like digging it up after 200 years and still having no clue what you're re-looking at. By the 1600s, the story of the princes in the tower had already become something between a national legend and a bedtime ghost tale. The Tudors were long gone. The Stuarts were bickering with Parliament, and England had moved on. But every time someone passed the Tower of London at night, they probably still thought, that's where they killed those poor boys. It was part of the atmosphere, like fog and ravens and suspicious beheadings. And then, in 1674, something interesting happened. Workmen doing repairs near the White Tower, that as the big square keep in the middle, dug up a small wooden chest. Inside were the bones of 2 children, tiny skeletons, about the right age for Edward V and his brother Richard. You can imagine the panic, because suddenly England's most famous historical rumor had a prop, and everyone from the court to the commoners wanted to believe they'd found the truth. King Charles II ordered the bones to be examined, though examined in the 17th century meant looked at by gentlemen in wigs who all nod solemnly. The verdict was quick and predictable. These must be the princes. The bones were placed in a marble urn and reburied in Westminster Abbey, near the tomb of their uncle Edward IV. It was a respectful gesture, and honestly, a convenient way to close the book on a mystery no one could actually solve. Except, of course, it didn't close the book. It just gave everyone a new chapter to argue about. The 1933 re-examination fast-forward another 250 years to 1933, the era of radio, cigarettes, and polite British archaeology. The urn was opened for a modern forensic examination. Scientists of the day, including a few from the Royal College of Surgeons, analyzed the bones. They determined that they belonged to 2 children, roughly 10 and 12 years old, which matched the princes' ages. Promising start, right? Well, not so fast. Even with modern tools, or 1930s modern at least, the results were inconclusive. The bones had been mixed with fragments of animal remains and showed no definitive signs of murder. No knife marks, no trauma, just death. To make it worse, the context was completely lost. The bones had been moved, handled, exposed to air, and possibly rearranged. The chest they were found in had disintegrated centuries ago. So what the experts really concluded was, we don't know, but they could be the princes. And that's about as solid as English history ever gets. The urn was resealed. The bones were left alone, partly out of respect, partly because no one wanted to admit that 300 years later, they still didn't know anything new. The ghosts that never left. If you spend a night in the tower, and yes, people still do, you will hear stories about small footsteps echoing down the corridor near the bloody tower, where the princes were last seen. Guards have reported the sound of children laughing softly or weeping faintly before vanishing into the walls. Now, I'm not here to sell ghost stories, but it's remarkable how often history and folklore overlap in places like this. The tower has seen so much blood and fear that maybe it is natural for the air to feel heavy. It's not really about spirits. It's about memory. Those walls have watched everything. Kings, queens, traitors, innocents. The energy just stays. So whether or not the princes ever haunt the tower, their absence certainly does. Let's talk motives again. You'd think after 500 years, we'd have moved on from arguing about who killed them. But historians can't help themselves. It's practically a national sport. The Richard III did it crowd still holds the crown. Mainly because it's tidy, and because Shakespeare helped cement the image with that famous hunchbacked villain. Remember, Richard III didn't just lose the throne. He lost the PR war for the next 5 centuries. But the revisionists have gained ground. Modern scholars point out that Richard had shown mercy to other rivals. He even spared the lives of Edward IV's daughters, the prince's own sisters, and treated them courteously. Would a man ruthless enough to smother 2 children suddenly grow sentimental toward their sisters? Possibly, but it muddies the narrative. Then there's Henry VII, the careful chess player. Once he took power, he married Elizabeth of York, the prince's eldest sister, uniting the 2 rival houses. It gave him legitimacy, but it also meant that if her brothers were alive, his claim was invalid. If that's not motive, I don't know what is. Still, no evidence, no witnesses, no confession, just layers of politics wrapped in silence. And the DNA question. Every few years, someone proposes testing the bones again, properly this time, with modern DNA sequencing. After all, we've successfully tested Richard III's remains, matching his genetic profile to modern descendants. So, in theory, we could compare the bones in the urn to known Plantagenet lines and finally confirm whether they really were Edward and Richard. The catch? Westminster Abbey refuses to allow further testing. Their reasoning is simple. They're royal children. Let them rest. Which, to be fair, is probably a good rule, but it also means the mystery remains forever half-answered. We could be sitting on the answer, literally in a church vault, but we'll never know for sure. There's a strange kind of poetry in that. The princes entered history as royal symbols, not people, and now even their bones are treated more like relics than evidence. The myth outlives the men. At some point, the princes stopped being about guilt or innocence, and became more like a morality tale, a reminder that even in palaces, children aren't safe from ambition. The Tudors used the story to justify their rule. The Victorians romanticized it with paintings of pale, doomed boys clutching each other in the shadows. Modern historians turn it into case studies on propaganda and power. But underneath all that, there's still something human. 2 brothers, separated from their mother, locked away by people they trusted, and erased so completely that we still argue about whether they even existed in the way we think they did. Their story isn't just tragic, it's quietly heartbreaking in that small, personal way. Not for the politics, not for the crown, just for the fact that they were children who became ghosts in history's most famous prison. And so, as the night deepens, we're left with this quiet question. Not who killed them, but why history needed them to die in the first place. How the princes became a legend. By the time the bones were reburied and the 20th century rolled in, the 2 princes were no longer people. They had become a kind of emotional wallpaper for British history. Always there, faintly tragic, decorating the background whenever someone mentioned the word usurpation. If you open any book about Richard III, you'll find the princes mentioned within the first few pages. They're the reason half of England still thinks of Richard as a monster, even though Shakespeare wrote that version of him 200 years after the fact. And even though Shakespeare was, shall we say, a bit of a Tudor employee. The Tudors needed villains to justify their dynasty. And Richard, he was perfect. Short reign, bad press, weird body, worse luck. And above all, an unsolved child murder that fit their propaganda needs like a glove. It didn't matter that the evidence was vague. What mattered was that everyone believed it. And from that belief, a story took root, one that's still alive today. The Tudor rewrite. Let's rewind to the first few decades after Bosworth Field, when Henry VII's crown was still a little wobbly on his head. He had a problem. His right to rule was weak. His claim to the throne came mostly through conquest and a sketchy family line, so he needed legitimacy. And legitimacy in Tudor England was basically just a good story told loudly. So the Tudor propaganda machine did what it did best. It started editing history. Chroniclers like Thomas More and Polydore Virgil began producing histories that were less about facts and more about reinforcing the idea that the Tudors had saved England from monsters. In these versions, Richard III wasn't just a schemer. He was a cartoon villain, a physically deformed tyrant who murdered children to snatch the crown. More's account described him as small, twisted, and consumed by envy and spite. It was theatrical. It was convenient. It was also, almost certainly, fiction. But it worked, because the human brain loves a clean narrative. Evil uncle kills innocent nephews, usurps the throne, dies in battle, justice is restored. Boom, that's tidy. The artistic obsession. And then came the painters. If you've ever seen one of those Victorian paintings of the princes, the boys in white nightshirts, huddled together with scared faces and a candle in the dark, you'll know the mood. Soft lighting, shiny tears, the occasional faithful dog. It's all very tragic and very marketable. Artists from the 18th and 19th centuries adored this theme. It had everything. Innocence, betrayal, darkness, mystery. Basically, free emotional engagement with a historical veneer. John Everett Millais, the pre-Raphaelite painter, even produced sketches that captured the boys in almost saintly poses. The Victorians had turned them into symbols of purity, royal martyrs, victims of ambition and cruelty. And let's be honest, Victorians loved their dead children. They wrote poems about them, carved them into marble, and covered their graves with angel wings. The princes fit right in. By that point, it wasn't about who killed them anymore. It was about how we felt about their suffering. They became emotional icons, the literary cult of innocence. Even Charles Dickens, who rarely missed a chance to moralize, wrote about the princes with palpable sadness. He described them as poor murdered innocents and called their story one of England as great moral stains. History had moved on, but literature kept them alive. And that's the funny thing about tragedy. It survives longer than triumph. No one writes sentimental ballads about administrative reforms or balanced budgets. But two lost children smothered by ambition, that's eternal. Every era reshaped the story to fit its mood. The Victorians turned it into moral tragedy. The early 20th century treated it like a Gothic mystery. The modern world treats it as a historical cold case. Each version says more about us than about them. The search for a good Richard. Meanwhile, Richard III has developed his own fandom, quite literally. There's an entire society called the Richard III Society, founded in 1924, whose mission is to clear his name. They're not fringe weirdos either. They've done serious historical and archaeological work, including helping to locate Richard's actual skeleton under a parking lot in Leicester in 2012. Yes, the king who supposedly murdered two children was found buried beneath a row of Toyotas. History has a sense of humor. His bones told a different story. Not of a deformed, snarling villain, but of a man who suffered scoliosis, fought bravely, and died violently. His body was mutilated post-mortem, probably stripped naked and thrown in a shallow grave. It humanized him. And suddenly people began wondering if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the monster Shakespeare made him out to be. But then, of course, the question returned. If Richard didn't kill the princes, who did? And the circle starts again. The paradox of power. There's a strange, almost meditative irony in this entire saga. Everyone in the story wanted power. Edward IV fought for it. Richard III died for it. Henry VII built a dynasty from it. And the princes, they lost their lives to it. Yet in the end, they're the only ones who achieved a kind of immortality. Their uncle's reputation still hangs on their disappearance. The Tudors' legitimacy still rests on their supposed murder. Their names are still whispered in history classes and bedtime podcasts centuries later. They became more powerful as ghosts than they ever were as living princes. That's the quiet cruelty of history. Sometimes, the people with the least control over their lives end up defining the legacy of everyone else. A quiet ending. Whenever you visit the tower today, there's a strange calm that settles over the place. The tourists come for the ravens, the jewels, and the ghost stories. But somewhere, beneath the stone floors and manicured lawns, there's still a sense of something unresolved. Maybe the bones in Westminster really are theirs. Maybe they're not. Maybe the truth was buried so deeply that no amount of excavation, physical or historical, can ever dig it out again. But what remains is a feeling. A quiet, persistent ache for two boys whose faces we only know through idealized paintings, whose fate we only guess at, and whose story reminds us that power, in the end, always comes at a price. Let's float over to the final thought, where history, myth, and memory blur into one long, sleepless question. What we choose to believe. It's strange, isn't it, how some stories just never settle. You'd think after half a millennium the mystery of the princes would have found peace. 2 graves, 2 names, end of story. But history isn't tidy. It's emotional, defensive, and sometimes a little petty. The princes in the tower sit right at the crossroads of all that. Politics, family, myth, and guilt. And the truth is, no one actually wants the mystery solved. Because if we solved it, if we suddenly found a scroll confessing the crime, or a DNA match confirming those bones, the story would stop being a story. It would just become another historical fact, dry and lifeless. And we'd lose that delicious uncertainty that makes it so human. We don't like facts as much as we like narratives. And this one has everything we crave: innocence, betrayal, loss, mystery, and a haunting silence. The comfort of ambiguity. In a way, the princes have become a kind of emotional mirror. For Richard III's defenders, they're a tragedy twisted by propaganda, proof that history can be unfair. For others, they're a symbol of innocence crushed by power, a reminder that monarchy, beneath all the gold and heraldry, is built on blood. For writers and dreamers, they're perfect, unresolved, poetic, eternal. And for everyone else, they're just 2 ghosts lingering in a fortress that still keeps secrets. Every few decades, some historian reopens the case, determined to find the answer. New theories appear. Maybe the boys were smuggled out of the tower. Maybe they grew up under false names. Maybe one of them became a pretender like Perkin Warbeck, that charming man who later claimed to be the younger prince and fooled half of Europe. But each time, the evidence dissolves under scrutiny. It's like trying to hold fog. The truth keeps slipping away. Maybe because it wants to. A study in silence. One of the saddest details in this whole story is how quiet it was. There was no outcry when the princes disappeared. No public mourning. No rebellion in their name. The people had seen so much chaos, decades of civil war, rival kings, broken oaths. The 2 vanished boys barely registered anymore. It's a grim reminder that tragedy doesn't always echo. Sometimes it just sinks. And maybe that's why their story lingers with us today, because our guilt arrived too late. We built sympathy for them centuries after it could have mattered. It's a kind of collective historical remorse. What history forgets. Most people forget that Edward V, before being imprisoned, was technically a reigning king, if only for a few weeks. He never had a coronation, but his name appears on official documents. So in some technical sense, he is one of England's ghost kings. a monarch whose reign existed more on parchment than in life. Richard, his younger brother, was just a child, 10 years old. He's often treated as a background figure. But by all accounts, he was bright and curious, fond of games and animals. And then, like his brother, he simply vanished. No grave markers, no remains confirmed. Just the kind of absence that feels too deliberate to be accidental. History's gentle cruelty. When you study royal history long enough, you notice a strange rhythm. The higher the birth, the heavier the fall. The princes were born into power, surrounded by silk, ceremony, and the illusion of safety. But power is the most unstable currency in the medieval world. One bad year, one ambitious uncle, and suddenly, the golden cradle becomes a prison cell. And that's really what this story is about. Not murder, not mystery, but fragility. The fragility of lineage, of truth, of memory. Because everyone in this story, Edward IV, Richard III, Henry VII, thought they were securing the future. Instead, they created a hole in history that can never be filled. That's kind of poetic, isn't it? All these men chasing permanence, only to be remembered for two children who disappeared under their watch. The Tower today. If you ever visit the Tower of London, you'll find the place oddly calm, more museum than menace. Tour guides point out the bloody tower with cheerful solemnity, and tourists snap photos in the same courtyard where Anne Boleyn once walked to her death. But somewhere under the cobblestones, near the foundation of the White Tower, there's still a faint tension in the air. It's subtle, like the air itself remembers something. And every so often, someone leaves flowers beneath the small memorial stone that marks the supposed resting place of the princes. No one knows why. No one really needs to. It's just what we do. A quiet gesture for two boys who never had funerals, but somehow ended up immortal anyway. The moral that isn't, every good story ends with a moral, but history rarely gives us clean ones. Maybe the lesson here is that power corrupts. Maybe it's that truth fades faster than rumor. Or maybe it's simpler, that even kings can protect their children from the consequences of ambition. Whatever it is, the princes have become more than victims. They have become a part of our collective conscience, a reminder that history isn't just written by the victors, but also haunted by the vanished. So, maybe that's the real ending. Not revelation, not justice, but remembrance. Two names, carved into the soft underbelly of English memory, quietly asking us not to forget them, even if we never really knew them at all. And that's where we'll leave them tonight, not buried under stone, not trapped in legend, but suspended somewhere in between, where memory keeps them alive just enough to make us wonder. Sleep well, princes, and sleep well, everyone else still trying to find them. The kingdom that forgot its children. When the princes vanished, England didn't stop. It never does. That's the strange rhythm of monarchy. One crown falls, and another is already waiting to be placed. Richard III wore it for just 2 uneasy years. And during those 2 years, not one official word was spoken about the boys. No proclamation, no announcement, no funeral, nothing. It was as if they'd been quietly edited out of history, while everyone politely pretended not to notice. People were used to that, of course. Medieval politics had its own brand of denial. One day, a rival existed. The next, they didn't. Chronicles skipped over names the same way courtiers avoided eye contact. It wasn't silence from ignorance. It was silence as policy. And yet, despite that silence, the absence of those boys was deafening. Rumors whispered through London like cold drafts. Some said the princes had died of illness. Others said they'd been spirited away. And others, the majority, believed what they were told to believe, that Richard had done what ambitious kings always did when they felt threatened. But the truth was, everyone knew how fragile the story was. Even those who hated Richard could sense that something about the whole thing didn't quite fit. After the fall, when Richard was killed at Bosworth in 1485, Henry Tudor's victory should have put the matter to rest. Instead, it made it worse. Because if the boys were alive, Henry's claim to the throne was weak, a problem he solved the same way every successful ruler does, by declaring that they weren't alive at all. He never produced the bodies. He never investigated. He just implied, and the implication worked. That was the beginning of what we might call the quiet rewriting of history. Richard's heraldic badges were destroyed. His supporters were executed or re-educated. And Shakespeare, generations later, would finish the job, sculpting the Richard we still picture today. A limping villain muttering in iambic pentameter about his own wickedness. It was brilliant propaganda. So brilliant that even centuries later, we still half believe it. But you know what the most fascinating part is? For all his power, Henry VII never mentioned the princes in any official record. Not once. The boys who supposedly justified his entire reign were never given a postscript, almost as if he was afraid to touch the story in case the truth slipped out. The pretenders, and then came the ghosts, or more accurately, the pretenders. First there was Lambert Simnel, a teenage baker's apprentice who was somehow convinced he was Edward Plantagenet, another lost royal cousin. His rebellion was crushed quickly, but the idea stuck. Then came the big one, Perkin Warbeck. Handsome, clever, and dangerously persuasive. He claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger prince. According to him, he'd escaped the Tower and spent years hidden in Flanders before resurfacing to reclaim his birthright. Europe, bored and always looking for ways to annoy England, believed him. He was recognized as royal by Margaret of Burgundy, sister of Edward IV. He was even hosted by the King of Scotland. Henry VII? He panicked, because whether Warbeck was real or not didn't matter. The very fact that he could be real meant the ghost of the Tower still haunted his crown. Warbeck was eventually captured and executed in 1499, not because he posed an actual threat, but because he represented a truth Henry couldn't afford to leave breathing. It's grimly poetic, isn't it? The boys disappear without proof, and then a man dies because he claims to be one of them. History has a way of balancing its own ironies. The Tower's reputation. After all this, the Tower of London never really recovered its image. It had always been a fortress and a prison, but after the princes it became something else, a symbol of state cruelty, a place where innocence was swallowed by power. From then on, every royal scandal seemed to echo theirs. When Anne Boleyn was imprisoned there, people whispered that she'd meet the same fate as the princes. When Lady Jane Grey was held there before her execution, the parallel was impossible to ignore. Another young royal locked up by a crown too insecure to let her live. The Tower became a character in its own right, silent, cold, but never neutral. And maybe that's why people still leave flowers for the princes. It's not just for them, it's for everyone the Tower consumed. The long sleep of the Plantagenets. The Plantagenet line ended with Richard III, but the ghosts of that family lingered long after, not as names in genealogies, but as cautionary tales. Edward IV, their father, had once been the Golden King of England, tall, handsome, victorious. His sons were supposed to be his legacy. Instead, they became his curse. And yet, in an oddly circular way, that same tragedy preserved their family's place in history. Because without the princess's disappearance, the Wars of the Roses might have faded into obscurity. Instead, it remains one of the most studied, dramatized, and debated eras in English memory. The boys' disappearance didn't erase their lineage. It immortalized it. You almost have to laugh at the irony. The echo in the present. Every few years, the debate flares up again. A historian finds a document in some dusty archive. A DNA expert gives an interview. A journalist suggests a new location for the bodies. And then it dies down again, unresolved, just as it always does. It's like the story itself refuses to end, as if the princes, wherever they are, have made peace with being the question instead of the answer. Maybe that's the truest form of immortality, not in being remembered clearly, but in never being forgotten completely. Their faces, half imagined and idealized, still stare out from paintings, textbooks, documentaries. They've become symbols of lost innocence, royal fragility, and history's favorite game, pretending to know. And so, the Tower stands. London changes around it, buses, skyscrapers, gift shops. But that old fortress just watches, keeping its secrets like a stone diary that doesn't bother turning the page. Because some stories are too quiet to die. the kingdom that never stopped wondering. So here we are, centuries later, and somehow we're still talking about two boys who vanished before they reached adulthood. That's England for you. It forgets the living but obsesses over the dead. The princes have become less like historical figures and more like folklore, the kind of story parents whisper when walking past the tower at night. That's where the lost princes were kept, they say, pointing up at a window glowing faintly gold in the London fog. No one knows what happened to them. And really, no one does. There are theories, of course, hundreds of them, all carefully footnoted and confidently wrong in their own ways. Theory 1. The uncle did it. This one's the classic. Richard III, the ambitious, cold-hearted uncle, seized the throne by killing his nephews. It's Shakespeare's favorite version, and honestly, it's the one most people still believe. But let's pause that thought. Richard had spent his entire career being loyal, not just to his brother Edward IV, but to the Yorkist cause itself. He was the reliable one, the quiet brother, the one who actually showed up to work. Yes, ambition changes people, but there's a difference between ambition and self-destruction. And murdering two royal heirs would have been political suicide. If he did it badly, because it gave his enemies exactly the weapon they needed to destroy him. You can almost imagine Richard pacing his chambers, realizing too late that the silence around the princes was more dangerous than their existence ever was. Because silence creates stories, and stories kill slower but surer. Theory 2. The Tudor cover-up. Then there's the counter-theory, that Henry VII had something to do with it. According to this idea, the princes might have been alive when Richard died, possibly hidden somewhere, possibly forgotten. When Henry came to power, he simply finished the job. Quietly, efficiently, Tudor style. It fits Henry's character better, honestly. The man was paranoid on a near-professional level. He changed his bedchamber every night, banned most of his relatives from visiting, and kept spies in monasteries just to eavesdrop on monks. And the fact that he never allowed a formal inquiry into the prince's fate, that's suspicious in itself. But again, no proof. Just layers of inference built on centuries of echo. Theory 3. The escape. The romantic theory, because history always needs one. According to this, at least one of the princes escaped. Maybe both. Maybe they lived out their lives under false names, somewhere far away, quietly watching their uncle and later the Tudors fight over the throne that should have been theirs. This version gets popular every few decades, usually when a new candidate appears. There was even a rumor in the 18th century that one of them had become a monk in Belgium. A monk. The irony of two boys raised for crowns ending up in silence and prayer is almost too poetic. But again, no documents, no DNA, no closure, just the comfort of maybe. Bones in the wake. In 1674, during renovations at the tower, workmen dug up a wooden box beneath a staircase in the White Tower. Inside were the bones of two children. The discovery caused an uproar. King Charles II ordered the bones placed in an urn and buried in Westminster Abbey, with an inscription declaring them to be, quite definitely, the princes in the tower. And everyone politely accepted that version. Because sometimes history just wants an ending, even if it's probably the wrong one. When the remains were re-examined in 1933, the evidence was inconclusive. They were indeed the bones of two children, roughly the right age. But the dating, placement, and preservation didn't fully match. Which means we're still right where we started. In the dark. The modern obsession. Even now, archaeologists, historians, and amateur sleuths keep circling the case like moths around an unsolved candle flame. Every generation thinks it'll be the one to solve it. We dig, we scan. We write books with confident titles like The True Fate of the Princes. And yet, every time, the trail fades out. The tower, it seems, still knows how to keep a secret. Maybe that's why people love this story so much. Because it's not really about finding the truth. It's about learning to live with the absence of one. We don't actually want the mystery solved, because the not knowing has become part of England's cultural DNA. the quiet hum behind all the crowns and ceremonies. Every time a new royal scandal breaks, someone eventually says it. Well, it's not as bad as what happened to the princes in the tower. That's when you realize they've become a benchmark for tragedy. The ghosts that don't haunt. Visitors to the tower sometimes claim to feel a chill when walking past the bloody tower, the supposed site of the boys' imprisonment. Some even claim to see them, pale and small, holding hands, staring from the shadows. But here's the thing, I don't think they'd haunt that place. If you believe in ghosts, and even if you don't, you get the sense those two wouldn't stick around where they were hurt. They'd go somewhere quieter, somewhere peaceful. Maybe they're the reason the tower's ravens never leave. Maybe they're the echo in the silence when the tourists have gone home. Not angry, not vengeful, just there. The sleep of history. If you strip away all the theories, all the books, all the centuries of moral lessons, what's left is something heartbreakingly simple. Two boys who were loved, used, and then erased. Their story isn't just a mystery, it's a mirror. It shows us what happens when power becomes more important than family. And yet, despite that, they've endured. They're still being talked about in 2025, 6 centuries later. That's more than most kings ever achieve. Maybe, in a strange way, they got what every monarch secretly wants: immortality. Not through rule, not through legacy, but through curiosity. They remain the ultimate what-if of English history. And maybe that's how they'd want it, to be the whisper that never fades. So next time you pass the tower or see its sharp silhouette against the fog, remember them. Not as victims, not as ghosts, just as two children who slipped through the cracks of history and somehow ended up everywhere. And then, maybe, just maybe, say goodnight. Because their story's been told enough for one evening, and that's where we'll leave it. Quiet, uncertain, and gently unfinished, just like the princes themselves. The echoes of two forgotten crowns. The strangest thing about history is how it remembers the wrong people. You can rule for decades, pass laws, win battles, and yet be forgotten within a generation. But disappear without a trace, and you'll live forever. The princes, Edward and Richard, have become less like people and more like symbols. Symbols of betrayal, innocence, and the quiet cruelty of power. They were born into one of the most unstable periods of English history, the Wars of the Roses, where family meant nothing and bloodlines were more like battle lines. It's easy to forget that when their father, Edward IV, died, the boys weren't just heirs. They were the last fragile threads holding a kingdom together, and maybe that's why they had to vanish. Because in a world of shifting crowns, children like them weren't symbols of hope. They were risks. The survival of the story. The odd part is, the prince's disappearance didn't cause chaos right away. For a while, people accepted Richard III's rule. The machinery of monarchy kept turning. There were parades, sermons, even songs praising the new king. But time is patient, and rumors, those are even more patient. Whispers began to spread. The boys hadn't been seen in months. Their windows were shuttered. Their guards changed too often. A servant said he'd heard crying one night, then silence. The stories grew. And by the time Richard fell at the Battle of Bosworth, the idea that he'd killed his nephews wasn't just rumor. It was legend. Henry Tudor didn't have to invent the story. He just had to let it grow. The aftermath of disappearance. When a child disappears, what you're really left with isn't just grief. It's the shape of what's missing. In art, in law, in royal ceremony, the absence of the princes kept echoing through centuries. Take the tower itself. It became a symbol of fear, a place not of power but of punishment. Every royal who entered it afterward carried the ghosts of those boys on their shoulders. Even Queen Elizabeth I, when she was briefly imprisoned there by her sister, wrote about how she couldn't sleep because the tower had seen too many tears. It's strange, isn't it? Two lost children changed the emotional geography of a building. The long shadow of Richard III. Now poor Richard, he's had the worst PR in English history. Shakespeare made him the poster child for villainy, a hunchbacked tyrant, sneering, deceitful, practically twirling his mustache. The kind of man who'd stab his nephews between monologues. And for centuries, that's how he was remembered. It wasn't until the 20th century, when historians actually started, reading documents, that Richard's reputation got a second look. They found letters showing loyalty, reforms showing fairness, even glimpses of decency. He wasn't an angel, but he wasn't Shakespeare's goblin either. Still, that didn't matter much when they found his bones under a parking lot in Leicester in 2012. The discovery revived everything. The wars, the myths, the arguments. It's almost poetic, really. Richard spent his life buried under rumors and then literally under asphalt. Henry VII and the Myth Machine. While Richard got buried in history's disdain, Henry VII got to write the next chapter. And boy, did he take advantage. He married the prince's sister, Elizabeth of York, effectively merging the feuding houses of York and Lancaster. It was a brilliant political move, though probably awkward family dinners. Still, Henry had a problem. As long as the fate of the princes was unknown, his own claim to the throne looked shaky. So, he leaned into the narrative that painted Richard as the murderer. Every royal chronicler under Henry's pay dutifully echoed the same version. Evil uncle, innocent boys, divine justice. It was simple, tragic, and effective. The irony, though, is thick enough to cut with an executioner's axe. The same man who may have benefited from their deaths became the one who made their story immortal. Pretenders and the endless search. Of course, once you leave a mystery open, the world rushes to fill it. That is how we got Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, two men who, decades later, claimed to be one of the lost princes. Lambert was a boy trained by ambitious men to impersonate Prince Edward. Henry VII captured him, and instead of executing him, made him work in the royal kitchens. A humble demotion, but it kept him alive. A walking joke more than a threat. Perkin Warbeck, on the other hand, was smoother, more convincing. He claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger prince. He traveled through Europe collecting powerful supporters, even convincing kings and queens that he was the rightful heir. Henry didn't find that amusing. When Warbeck was captured, he was paraded through London in mock triumph before being executed. Whether either was real or not doesn't matter much now. What matters is that the story of the princes had become powerful enough to raise armies, a country haunted by its children. England, as a nation, has a peculiar relationship with guilt. It turns its crimes into cautionary tales and its failures into folklore. The princes in the Tower became the perfect vessel for that. Their story whispered a lesson into every future monarch's ear. The crown is heavier when it is stolen. Every king and queen since has, in one way or another, lived in the shadow of that truth. Even now, when you walk through Westminster Abbey, you'll find their names carved in stone, not as rulers but as reminders. When silence becomes sacred, maybe that's why, to this day, there's resistance to reopening their urn for DNA testing. Some say it's out of respect. Others admit it's superstition. But perhaps it's because people secretly don't want the mystery solved. Because if we knew the truth, if science stripped the last layer of uncertainty away, something human would be lost too. There's comfort in not knowing, in imagining, in believing that somewhere in history's fog, two small figures are still walking, still holding hands, still unbroken by what was done to them. They've become a story, and stories, unlike people, don't die. So maybe we should stop looking for bones and start listening for echoes, the ones that come through the centuries whenever a crown changes hands. Because every time that happens, a quiet question rises from the stones of the tower itself. And what of the princes? No answer comes, of course, just silence. But it's a silence that hums, and that, more than anything, keeps them alive. Remembering the princes. And so, after all the rumors, rebellions, bones, and ghosts, we arrive at the quietest part of the story. The part where history stops trying to explain itself and simply remembers. The Tower of London, cold and gray, has watched centuries unfold. Kings have been crowned, wars have ended, empires have risen and fallen, and still, it holds the memory of two small boys who never returned home. Their presence isn't in documents or political decisions, though. It's in the air, in the stones, in the way light falls across the courtyard in the late afternoon. Sometimes it's easy to imagine them there, not frightened, not pale with despair, but simply waiting for a world that never quite understood them, for historians who would debate them endlessly, for storytellers who would carry them into centuries of imagination. The gentle tragedy. The prince's story isn't one of heroism or conquest. It's not filled with battles won or policies enacted. It's a story of absence, and yet, that absence has power. It teaches us more than victories ever could. It teaches us that history is fragile, that innocence can be consumed by ambition, that even kings cannot always protect what they hold most dear. It reminds us that memory, imagination, and legend often outlive the facts. We remember Edward and Richard not because we know what happened, but because we feel the weight of what might have happened. Their names echo through history classrooms, novels, paintings, and podcasts like this one. Whispers of a past that refuses to be tidy. The princes as symbols over time. The princes have become more than themselves. They are symbols of lost potential, of innocence betrayed, of the fragile thread that holds families, kingdoms, and stories together. Artists, writers, and historians have given them faces, personalities, and lives that history never recorded. We imagine Edward's curiosity, Richard's mischief. We imagine their laughter echoing through the halls of the tower, their games interrupted by footsteps that would decide the fate of a kingdom. Even Shakespeare, centuries later, would amplify the drama, making the moral lesson of the Lost Princes a cautionary tale about ambition, loyalty, and the dangerous hunger for power. The Tower and modern memory. Today, the Tower is no longer a place of fear. It is a museum, a historical site, a destination for tourists. Yet, if you pause for a moment while walking through the quiet corridors, you can almost feel the weight of its stories. The Prince's Tale is one of those stories, gentle, tragic, unresolved. Visitors leave flowers, historians debate, and storytellers like me whisper their narrative into the night, keeping them alive in the only way history allows. Because the prince's real immortality is not in crowns, documents, or bloodlines. It's in memory, in the quiet echo that continues to reach us, even 600 years later. A bedtime reflection. So tonight, as we dim the lights and let history's quiet hum settle around us, think of Edward and Richard, not as ghosts, not as victims, but as reminders of the delicate, unpredictable tapestry of life and power. They teach us that history isn't always about closure. Sometimes it's about presence, about noticing what isn't there, about giving attention to the silences, the absences, and the spaces between the dates and deeds. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. Their story lingers because we allow it to. It drifts through time like a soft sigh across centuries. It invites us to remember, reflect, and quietly wonder. Because in the end, the princes in the tower remind us that the past is not only written in ink and stone, it is written in memory, in imagination, in the quiet spaces where stories never truly end. So tonight, we leave them there, suspended in history, hovering in memory, and quietly, eternally, present. Sleep well, princes, and sleep well, all who listen. Two young princes vanish from the Tower of London, leaving England with a mystery that has haunted history for over 600 years. Was it the ambition of their uncle, Richard III, a Tudor cover-up, or did they somehow escape? This story gently drifts through the quiet, eerie corridors of power, exploring lost innocence, royal intrigue, and the fragile human cost of ambition. A haunting tale of absence, memory, and history that refuses to be forgotten. If this story of the lost princes left you wondering and reflecting, don't drift off just yet. Subscribe to Stories Before Sleep for more hauntingly quiet tales of history, mystery, and forgotten lives. Perfect for your bedtime listening. Hit the bell so you never miss a story that lingers long after the lights go out.